Operation Phoenix, the secret assassination program nobody talks about. Untold Vietnam Chronicles. Welcome back to Untold Vietnam Chronicles. Tonight we're diving into one of the darkest chapters of the Vietnam War. A story so controversial, so morally complex, that both the American government and the Vietnamese government agreed to bury it for decades. This isn't about battles or heroic soldiers. This is about something far more sinister. A systematic assassination program that killed over 20,000 people and changed the nature of warfare forever. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from Vietnam that they don't teach in history class. Like this video if you want to hear the real stories behind America's most classified operations. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing our global community of history seekers. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, because tonight we're talking about Operation Phoenix, the CIA's secret war within the war. And if you think you know how dark the Vietnam conflict got, you haven't heard anything yet. Chapter 1, The Birth of a Shadow War. It started with a simple problem. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? By 1967, the Vietnam War had devolved into a brutal game of cat and mouse. The Viet Cong didn't wear uniforms. They didn't line up for conventional battles. They melted into the civilian population during the day and emerged at night to plant bombs, stage ambushes, and gather intelligence. For American commanders, this presented an impossible challenge. How do you defeat an insurgency when you can't tell the difference between a rice farmer and a bomb maker? How do you win a war when your enemy looks exactly like the people you're supposed to be protecting? The answer came from a soft-spoken CIA analyst named Robert Comer. Comer had spent years studying communist insurgencies around the world, and he believed he had found the solution. The Viet Cong's strength didn't come from their military capabilities. It came from their political infrastructure. Hidden throughout South Vietnam was a vast network of communist sympathizers, tax collectors, recruiters, propagandists, and local leaders who kept the insurgency alive. Comer's proposal was elegantly simple and morally horrifying. Identify every single person in this shadow government and eliminate them, not capture them, not interrogate them, eliminate them. We need to cut off the head of the snake, Comer told his superiors at CIA headquarters. But in this case, the snake has 1,000 heads. In May 1967, President Lyndon Johnson signed a classified directive authorizing what would become known as Operation Phoenix. The official name was the Infrastructure Coordination and Exploitation Program, but everyone involved knew what it really was: a license to kill. The program was placed under the joint control of the CIA, US military intelligence, and South Vietnamese security forces. The goal was ambitious beyond anything attempted in modern warfare. Create detailed dossiers on every suspected communist agent in South Vietnam, then systematically hunt them down and kill them. To understand how revolutionary this was, you have to understand the scale. South Vietnam had a population of 17 million people. The Viet Cong infrastructure was estimated to include anywhere from 75,000 to 300,000 individuals. Phoenix wasn't planning to capture a few high-value targets. They were planning to decapitate an entire shadow government. The operation was divided into regional coordinating centers, each responsible for specific provinces. These centers would collect intelligence from every available source, captured documents, interrogated prisoners, paid informants, and surveillance operations. They would cross-reference this information to create detailed target lists, then dispatch elimination teams to carry out the killings. But there was a problem that became apparent almost immediately. In a country where everyone was potentially a suspect, and everyone looked like a civilian, how do you tell the difference between a genuine communist agent and an innocent farmer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? The answer, according to classified Phoenix documents declassified in the 1990s, was that you didn't worry about it. You killed them all and let God sort it out. Chapter 2. The Blacklist Machine. The heart of Operation Phoenix was a bureaucracy of death, unlike anything the world had ever seen. In a nondescript office building in Saigon, hundreds of analysts worked around the clock to create what they called the blacklist, a constantly updated database of every suspected communist sympathizer in South Vietnam. The process started with raw intelligence gathering. Phoenix teams collected information from captured documents, interrogated prisoners under torture, paid civilian informants, and conducted surveillance operations. But the real innovation was how they processed this information. Using early computer systems provided by IBM, Phoenix analysts could cross-reference names, locations, associations, and activities, identify patterns that might indicate communist sympathies. If someone's name appeared on a captured Viet Cong document, they went on the list. If a prisoner under interrogation mentioned someone as a possible sympathizer, they went on the list. If an informant reported suspicious behavior, they went on the list. The beauty of the system, from the CIA's perspective, was its completeness. Previous counterinsurgency operations had focused on capturing known enemy leaders. Phoenix aimed to map the entire communist infrastructure and eliminate it systematically. The horror of the system was its complete disregard for evidence or due process. People were added to the blacklist based on rumors, forced confessions, and guilt by association. There was no appeals process, no judicial review, no presumption of innocence. If your name appeared on the Phoenix blacklist, you were marked for death. William Colby, the CIA officer who oversaw Phoenix operations, later admitted in congressional testimony that the program operated with minimal oversight and that mistakes were inevitable. But those mistakes were in administrative errors. They were human life. The target lists were updated weekly and distributed to elimination teams throughout South Vietnam. These teams operated under a simple mandate: find the people on the list and kill them. Methods were left to the discretion of local command. Some Phoenix operations were sophisticated affairs, involving weeks of surveillance and careful planning. Teams would study their targets' routines, identify vulnerabilities, and strike with precision. The target would simply disappear, leaving behind only rumors and fear. Other operations were crude massacres. Teams would surround a village suspected of harboring communist sympathizers and kill anyone whose name appeared on their lists. Family members who tried to intervene were often killed as well, their deaths attributed to resisting arrest. But the most disturbing aspect of Phoenix wasn't the killing, it was the paperwork. Every elimination was carefully documented, with detailed reports filed on the target's background, the methods used to kill them, and the intelligence value of their death. The bureaucracy of murder was meticulous. By 1969, Phoenix teams were eliminating an average of 500 targets per month. The program was working exactly as designed, systematically destroying the Viet Cong's political infrastructure one assassination at a time. Chapter 3. The Provincial Reconnaissance Units. The actual killing was carried out by units with an innocuous name that masked their deadly purpose: Provincial Reconnaissance Units, or PRUs. On paper, these were intelligence-gathering teams, tasked with identifying communist infiltrators. In reality, they were death squads. Each PRU typically consisted of 15 to 20 men, drawn from South Vietnamese Special Forces, CIA-trained operatives, and local mercenaries. They were equipped with the latest weapons, given unlimited budgets, and told to operate with complete autonomy. Their only oversight came from CIA advisors, who provided target lists and logistical support. The PRUs operated with a level of brutality that shocked even veteran soldiers. Unlike conventional military units, they weren't bound by rules of engagement or the Geneva Convention. Their mission was to terrorize the civilian population into withdrawing support for the Viet Cong, and they used whatever methods they deemed effective. Torture was routine. PRU interrogation centers throughout South Vietnam were equipped with electric shock devices, waterboards, and other implements designed to extract information and confession. Prisoners who survived the interrogation were usually killed anyway. Their deaths were considered necessary to prevent them from warning other communist agents.
But torture wasn't just used to gather intelligence, it was used as a terror tactic. PRUs would often torture victims in public or leave mutilated bodies in prominent locations as warnings to the local population. The message was clear: this is what happens to people who cooperate with the Viet Cong. The psychological impact was devastating.
In areas where PRUs operated, civilian cooperation with US forces increased dramatically, not out of loyalty, but out of terror. People provided information about their neighbors, reported suspicious activities, and avoided any behavior that might attract attention from the death squads. One former PRU operative, speaking anonymously to investigators in the 1990s, described the unit's methods. "We didn't arrest people, we eliminated problems. If someone was suspected of helping the VC, we killed them. If their family complained, we killed them too. It was simpler that way." The CIA's own internal documents, declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, revealed the extent of PRU operations. Between 1968 and 1972, PRUs conducted over 80,000 elimination missions throughout South Vietnam. Of these, approximately 26,000 resulted in confirmed kills. But the true horror of the PRU program wasn't the number of people killed, it was the deliberate targeting of civilians. Unlike conventional military operations, which at least pretended to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, the PRUs specifically targeted people who had never fired a shot: village chiefs, school teachers, tax collectors, and anyone else suspected of supporting the communist cause. The justification, according to classified CIA memos, was that these civilians were more dangerous than armed soldiers. "A propaganda agent can do more damage than a company of infantry," one memo argued. "We must treat political warfare with the same seriousness as conventional warfare." This logic led to increasingly brutal operations. PRUs began targeting not just suspected communist agents, but their families, friends, and anyone who associated with them. The theory was that eliminating entire social networks would prevent the regrowth of communist infrastructure. The reality was mass murder disguised as counterinsurgency. Chapter 4. The My Lai Connection. The most infamous atrocity of the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre, was directly connected to Operation Phoenix. Though this connection has been largely hidden from public view, the unit responsible for My Lai, Charlie Company of the 20th Infantry Regiment, had been operating under Phoenix protocols for months before the massacre occurred. On March 16, 1968, Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai with a mission that came straight from Phoenix playbooks: eliminate suspected Viet Cong infrastructure. Intelligence reports suggested that several villagers were providing support to communist forces. The company's orders were to identify these individuals and neutralize them. What happened next has been documented extensively, but what's rarely discussed is how Phoenix protocols contributed to the massacre. Charlie Company had been trained under Phoenix guidelines that emphasized the elimination of suspected enemies rather than their capture. They had been told repeatedly that distinguishing between innocent civilians and communist sympathizers was impossible, and that it was better to err on the side of aggression. Lieutenant William Calley, who led the massacre, later testified that his orders were to kill everyone in the village because they were all suspected of being communist sympathizers or supporters. These weren't rogue orders from a psychotic commander. They were consistent with Phoenix operational doctrine. The cover-up that followed My Lai was also typical of Phoenix operations. Initial reports claimed that Charlie Company had engaged in a successful combat operation against Viet Cong forces. The civilian deaths were attributed to crossfire and enemy action. It was only when independent journalist Seymour Hersh investigated the incident that the truth emerged. But My Lai wasn't an aberration. It was the logical extension of Phoenix philosophy taken to its extreme. If you believe that civilian supporters of the enemy are legitimate targets, and if you believe that distinguishing between supporters and innocents is impossible, then massacring entire villages becomes a rational military tactic. Internal CIA documents from 1968 reveal that My Lai-style operations were more common than the public ever knew. A classified memo from CIA Director Richard Helms to President Johnson described numerous incidents of excessive force during Phoenix operations, including several village-level elimination missions. Similar to My Lai, the memo, declassified in 2006, noted that distinguishing between legitimate targets and innocent civilians has proven problematic in field operations, and recommended revised protocols to minimize collateral damage. But there's no evidence that these protocols were ever implemented. Instead, Phoenix operations continued with the same brutal efficiency, but with better operational security. Teams were instructed to conduct eliminations away from villages, when possible, to avoid witnesses, and to dispose of bodies in ways that would prevent discovery. The lesson learned from My Lai wasn't that mass killing of civilians was wrong. It was that getting caught was bad for public relations. Chapter 5. The Quotas System. 1969. Operation Phoenix had evolved into a bureaucratic machine that treated murder like a business quota. Regional commanders were given monthly targets for the number of suspected communist agents they were required to eliminate. Bonuses were paid for exceeding quotas. Promotions were based on body counts. The pressure to meet these quotas led to increasingly indiscriminate killing. When legitimate targets became scarce, Phoenix teams began expanding their definitions of who constituted a communist sympathizer. Anyone who criticized the South Vietnamese government could be labeled as subversive. Anyone who refused to cooperate with authorities could be considered suspicious. Anyone who lived in areas with heavy Viet Cong activity could be presumed guilty by association. Former CIA operative Frank Snepp, who worked on Phoenix operations, later wrote, "The quota system corrupted everything. We were supposed to be eliminating genuine enemy agents, but we ended up killing anyone we could justify putting on the lists." It became a numbers game where the numbers mattered more than the accuracy. The CIA's own internal audit of Phoenix operations, conducted in 1970, but not declassified until 1999, revealed the extent of the problem. Of the 20 and some 587 people killed during Phoenix operations between 1968 and 1970, the audit found that only about 12% could be confirmed as actual members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. The rest were civilians, whose only crime was appearing on assassination lists, generated by unreliable intelligence. But rather than shutting down the program, the CIA simply refined its methods. New guidelines were issued requiring additional verification for targets, but these guidelines were regularly ignored by field operatives under pressure to meet their quota. The quota system also created a perverse incentive structure that encouraged brutality. Teams that killed their targets quickly and efficiently were rewarded with more resources and better assignment. Teams that attempted to capture targets alive or verify their identities were seen as inefficient. This led to the development of what Phoenix operatives called dead check operations, missions specifically designed to kill rather than capture. These operations were planned under the assumption that prisoners were more trouble than they were worth, and that dead communist agents couldn't provide false information under interrogation. The bureaucratic language used to describe these operations was chillingly clinical. Targets weren't murdered or assassinated, they were neutralized or eliminated. Innocent victims weren't collateral damage, they were misidentified assets. The systematic killing of civilians wasn't mass murder, it was infrastructure degradation. This sanitized language served a psychological function for the people implementing the program. By removing human emotion from the killing process, Phoenix administrators could treat murder as just another administrative task. The victims became statistics, and statistics don't have families who grieve for them. Chapter 6. The Tiger Cages. Perhaps the most horrific aspect of Operation Phoenix was the prison system that supported. Throughout South Vietnam, the CIA established a network of detention centers where suspected communist agents were held, interrogated, and often tortured to death. The most notorious of these facilities was the Con Son Island prison complex, known for its tiger cages, underground cells barely large enough for a human being to lie down. Prisoners were kept in these cages for months at a time, subjected to constant torture, and fed just enough to keep them alive for continued interrogation. The conditions in these facilities were deliberately designed to break prisoners' psychological
tiger cages were built without windows or ventilation. Prisoners were naked, regardless of weather conditions. They were given minimal food and water, and were forced to defecate where they slept. Guards would pour lime powder on prisoners from above, causing chemical burns and respiratory damage. But the physical torture was only part of the horror. Prison guards trained by CIA psychologists used sophisticated psychological warfare techniques designed to destroy prisoners' sense of identity and reality. Prisoners were subjected to sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, sexual humiliation, and constant verbal abuse. Many prisoners were never formally charged with any crime. They were simply suspected of communist sympathies and had been swept up in Phoenix Operation. Some had been tortured into confessing to activities they had never committed. Others had been denounced by neighbors, seeking to settle personal grudges. The CIA's own documentation of these facilities, released through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveals the systematic nature of the torture. Daily reports from Con Son included detailed descriptions of interrogation techniques, prisoner responses, and recommendations for enhanced methods when standard torture wasn't producing results. One particularly disturbing document, dated July 1969, describes experiments with psychological torture techniques that would later be used at CIA black sites during the War on Terror. Prisoners were subjected to prolonged stress positions, sexual humiliation, exploitation of phobias, and sensory manipulation designed to induce psychosis. The document notes that subjects experiencing complete psychological breakdown provided the most reliable intelligence, and recommends extending psychological pressure until subject achieves total compliance or expire. Of the estimated 40,000 prisoners who passed through Phoenix detention facilities, approximately 26,000 died in custody. Most of these deaths were listed as suicides or medical complications, but internal CIA documents revealed that many were the direct result of torture. Former prison guard William Van Thieu, interviewed by investigative journalists in the 1990s, described the casual brutality of the system. We were told these people were enemies of the state, who didn't deserve human treatment. We were encouraged to be creative in our method. The only rule was not to let them die too quickly. We needed them alive long enough to get information. Chapter 7. The Defectors and Whistleblowers. As Operation Phoenix expanded, some of the people involved began to question what they were doing. The first major defector was CIA operative Kenneth Barton Osborne, who had been assigned to Phoenix operations in 1967, and gradually became horrified by what he witnessed. Osborne later testified before Congress, "I never knew in the course of all those operations any detainee to live through his interrogation. They all died. There was never any reasonable establishment of the fact that any of those individuals were actually engaged in activities hostile to the government of South Vietnam." But Osborne's testimony was largely ignored by Congress, which was reluctant to investigate a classified program during an ongoing war. It wasn't until 1971 that serious scrutiny began, when former South Vietnamese Colonel William Van Thieu publicly described Phoenix operations and provided documented evidence of systematic torture and murder. Thieu's revelations were explosive because they came from inside the South Vietnamese government. As a colonel in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, Thieu had worked closely with Phoenix teams and had access to operational documents that proved the program's true scope. According to Thieu's testimony, Phoenix operations were genocide disguised as counterinsurgency. He provided Congress with detailed records showing that Phoenix teams had killed over 20,000 people by 1971, most of them civilians with no proven connection to the communist movement. Thieu's documents also revealed the extent to which Phoenix operations were driven by corruption rather than intelligence. South Vietnamese officials were selling names to Phoenix teams for cash payment. Personal enemies could be eliminated simply by paying the right officials to add their names to target lists. The program had become a murder-for-hire scheme disguised as national security. The most damning evidence Thieu provided was a series of photographs showing Phoenix torture sessions. These images, taken for training purposes, depicted systematic brutality that violated every international law governing the treatment of prisoners. When these photographs were shown during congressional hearings, several members of Congress walked out of the room. But even this evidence wasn't enough to shut down Phoenix operations. The program was simply transferred from CIA control to military control, renamed Phong Hong, and continued operating with slightly modified procedure. The message was clear. As long as the killing was done quietly and efficiently, the American government was willing to look the other way. Chapter 8. The Body Count War. By 1970, Operation Phoenix had generated so many corpses that body disposal became a logistical challenge. CIA documents from this period revealed discussions about waste management protocols and environmental considerations related to the program's activities. The preferred method was to make targets simply disappear. Phoenix teams would abduct suspects from their homes at night, kill them at remote locations, and dispose of the bodies where they would never be found. This approach served multiple purposes. It prevented
family members from confirming deaths, eliminated evidence of torture, and created psychological terror in the general population. Other bodies were dumped in rivers, buried in mass graves, or incinerated at remote facilities. The CIA established several processing centers throughout South Vietnam, where bodies were systematically destroyed. These facilities were disguised as agricultural stations or medical research centers, but the scale of killing eventually exceeded the capacity for covert disposal. Bodies began appearing in public places, clearly showing signs of torture. Families started finding mutilated corpses of their relatives, dumped along roadsides or in rice paddies. Rather than scaling back the program, Phoenix administrators decided to use this public visibility as a psychological weapon. Tortured and mutilated bodies were deliberately left in prominent locations as warnings to the general population. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to people who oppose the government. The psychological impact was devastating. In areas where Phoenix operations were most active, civilian cooperation with government forces increased dramatically. Not out of loyalty, but out of sheer terror. People began denouncing their neighbors to avoid suspicion themselves. Social trust collapsed as everyone became potential informants or potential targets. Former Phoenix operative James Parker later described the atmosphere. "We had created a climate of pure fear. Nobody trusted anybody. People were afraid to talk to their own family members because they never knew who might be listening. We had turned the entire population into potential enemies of each other." This social destruction was actually considered a success by Phoenix administrators. Internal CIA memos from 1970 praised the degradation of enemy social cohesion and recommended expanding psychological warfare operations to other conflict zones. The human cost was staggering. Beyond the direct deaths from Phoenix operations, the program contributed to social collapse that led to thousands of additional deaths from starvation, disease, and civil violence. Entire communities disintegrated as people fled areas where Phoenix teams operate. But from the Pentagon's perspective, the program was working. Viet Cong recruiting became more difficult in areas where Phoenix operated. Communist tax collection dropped significantly. The shadow government that supported the insurgency was systematically destroyed. The only problem was that destroying the Viet Cong infrastructure also destroyed the social fabric that held South Vietnamese society together. Chapter 9. The International Dimension. Operation Phoenix wasn't just an American program. It was part of a broader international network of assassination programs coordinated by the CIA. Similar operations were running simultaneously in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines, all designed to eliminate communist insurgencies through systematic murder. The coordination of these programs was handled through a classified organization called the Southeast Asia Coordination Group, which operated out of CIA headquarters in Langley. This organization shared intelligence, training methods, and assassination techniques across national boundary. Declassified documents reveal that Phoenix operatives were regularly rotated between different countries to share expertise and prevent any single group from developing moral qualms about their activity. A team that had been killing suspected communists in Vietnam might be transferred to Laos to kill suspected Pathet Laos supporters, then moved to Thailand to eliminate suspected insurgents there. This rotation system served multiple purposes. It prevented operatives from developing relationships with local populations that might interfere with their willingness to kill. It shared successful techniques across different theaters of operation, and it created a core of professional assassins who could be deployed anywhere the CIA needed systematic killing done. The international dimension of Phoenix operations also included training programs for foreign intelligence service. The CIA established schools in Virginia and Panama, where officers from allied nations learned Phoenix techniques. These programs trained thousands of foreign operatives in torture, assassination, and psychological warfare methods. Many of these foreign operatives later implemented Phoenix-style programs in their own countries. The mass killings that occurred in Indonesia, Chile, Argentina, and El Salvador during the 1970s and the global spread of Phoenix methodology created what intelligence historians call the industrialization of assassination. Phoenix demonstrated that systematic murder could be scaled up to eliminate thousands of people efficiently and cost-effectively. CIA training manuals from this period, declassified in the 1990s, reveal the systematic nature of this education. Foreign operatives were taught to create target lists, establish elimination quotas, manage torture centers, and dispose of bodies on an industrial scale. One particularly chilling document, titled Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, provides detailed instructions for psychological torture, including techniques for inducing psychosis, breaking family bonds, and creating false confession. This manual was used to train intelligence operatives from dozens of countries throughout the 1970s. The international legacy of Operation Phoenix is still visible today. Many of the interrogation techniques used at Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and CIA black sites were originally developed during Phoenix operations. The systematic torture programs that characterized the War on Terror were direct descendants of methods pioneered in Vietnam. Chapter 10. The cover-up begins. As the Vietnam War began winding down in the early 1970s, the CIA faced a problem: how to hide the evidence of systematic murder that Operation Phoenix had created. The solution was a massive cover-up operation that involved destroying documents, silencing witnesses, and creating false narratives about the program's activities. The document destruction began in 1973. As American forces prepared to withdraw from Vietnam, entire warehouses full of Phoenix files were incinerated at remote facilities throughout South Vietnam. Computer records were wiped. Photographs and video evidence were destroyed. Physical evidence from torture centers was bulldozed and buried. The scale of this destruction was unprecedented in intelligence history. According to CIA estimates, over 90% of Phoenix operational documents were destroyed. The remaining 10% were classified at the highest levels and stored in ultra-secure facilities, where they would remain hidden for decades. But destroying documents wasn't enough. The CIA also had to silence the people who had implemented the program. Phoenix operatives were given new identities and reassigned to positions where they would have no reason to discuss their Vietnam experiences. Many were transferred to Latin America, where they would implement similar programs under different names. South Vietnamese officials who had worked with Phoenix were evacuated to the United States and given lucrative positions in exchange for their silence. Those who couldn't be relocated were simply eliminated, their deaths attributed to communist revenge killings during the chaos of Saigon's fall. The most systematic aspect of the cover-up involved creating false narratives about Phoenix operations. CIA historians were tasked with writing official accounts of the program that minimized its scope and these sanitized versions became the basis for most academic and journalistic accounts of Phoenix for the next 20 years. The false narratives portrayed Phoenix as a limited intelligence gathering operation that occasionally used enhanced interrogation methods. The systematic torture, mass murder, and deliberate targeting of civilians were either omitted entirely or described as aberrations committed by rogue operatives. These false narratives were supported by carefully selected document releases that provided just enough information to satisfy congressional investigators without revealing the true scope of Phoenix operation. The CIA would release documents showing that some torture occurred
while hiding documents that showed the systematic nature of the torture. They would acknowledge that some innocent people were killed, while hiding evidence that innocent people were deliberately targeted. This selective disclosure created a false impression that Congress and the media had thoroughly investigated Phoenix operations and found only limited abuses. In reality, investigators had been given access to less than 5% of the relevant. The cover-up was so successful that even today, most Americans have never heard of Operation Phoenix. Those who have encountered the name usually know it only as a controversial intelligence program, rather than as systematic mass murder. Chapter 11: The truth emerges. It wasn't until the 1990s that the true scope of Operation Phoenix began to emerge, largely due to the persistence of investigative journalists and the declassification of documents under the Freedom of Information Act. But even these revelations only scratched the surface of the program's activities. The most significant breakthrough came in 1995, when former Phoenix operative Kenneth Osborne provided journalists with copies of documents he had secretly preserved before the mass destruction of. These documents revealed the systematic nature of Phoenix operations and contradicted decades of official denials. Osborne's documents showed that Phoenix wasn't an intelligence-gathering program that occasionally used violence. It was an assassination program that occasionally gathered intelligence. The primary mission was killing, and intelligence collection was simply a byproduct of torture sessions that preceded executions. More revelations came from South Vietnamese sources. As Vietnam normalized relations with the United States in the 1990s, Vietnamese officials began releasing their own documents about Phoenix operations. These files, preserved in Vietnamese archives, provided detailed records of Phoenix activities from the perspective of the victim. The Vietnamese documents revealed that Phoenix operations had been even more extensive than previously known. The program had operated in every province of South Vietnam, had maintained detailed files on over 300,000 suspected communist sympathizers, and had eliminated approximately but perhaps the most disturbing revelation was that Phoenix operations had continued after the official end of the program. CIA documents released in the 2000s showed that assassination teams trained under Phoenix protocols had been deployed to Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa throughout the 90s. These later operations used the same techniques developed during Phoenix: systematic target identification, torture-based interrogation, and systematic elimination of suspected enemies. The Phoenix methodology had become standard operating procedure for American covert operations worldwide. Former CIA Director William Colby, who oversaw Phoenix operations, finally acknowledged the program's true nature in a 1995 interview. Phoenix was designed to destroy the Viet Cong infrastructure through systematic elimination of suspected agents. We killed a lot of people, many of whom were probably innocent, but it was war, and in war, innocent people die. This admission was as close to an official acknowledgement as the CIA was willing to provide. Despite overwhelming evidence of systematic torture and murder, the agency maintained that Phoenix operations were within the bounds of acceptable wartime conduct.
The families of Phoenix victims had a different perspective. In 2000, a group of Vietnamese Americans filed a class action lawsuit against the CIA, seeking compensation for relatives who had been killed during Phoenix operations. The lawsuit was dismissed on national security grounds, but it brought public attention to the program's continuing legacy. Epilogue: The Phoenix Legacy. Today, over 50 years after Operation Phoenix officially ended, its impact is still being felt around the world. The techniques developed during Phoenix operations became the foundation for American torture and assassination programs that continue to this day. The interrogation methods used at Guantanamo Bay, the targeted killing programs conducted by drones, the systematic elimination of suspected terrorists, all of these modern practices can trace their origins back to Operation Phoenix. The program demonstrated that democratic governments could engage in systematic murder if they used the right bureaucratic language and maintained proper operational security. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Phoenix isn't tactical, it's psychological. The program proved that ordinary people could be trained to commit systematic murder if the killing was presented as necessary for national security, and if the victims were dehumanized through propaganda. The bureaucrats who designed Phoenix assassination lists weren't psychopaths. They were career civil servants who believed they were defending democracy. The operators who carried out the killings weren't sadists. They were professional soldiers following orders from legitimate authority figures. This ordinariness of evil is what makes Phoenix so terrifying. It demonstrates how easily systematic murder can be integrated into bureaucratic structures, and how quickly societies can accept mass killing as normal policy. The lessons of Phoenix are particularly relevant today, as governments around the world implement surveillance programs, detention policies, and targeted killing operations that echo Phoenix methodology. The same moral compromises that enabled Phoenix, the belief that security justifies any means, the dehumanization of suspected enemies, the assumption that innocent deaths are acceptable collateral damage, continue to influence policy decisions in the 21st. Operation Phoenix ended in 1973, but its ghost haunts us still. In every drone strike that kills civilians, in every torture session justified by national security, in every assassination disguised as military action, the spirit of Phoenix lives on. The program's most chilling legacy isn't the 26,000 people it killed. It's the demonstration that systematic murder can be normalized, bureaucratized, and hidden in plain sight. Phoenix showed that darkness doesn't come from monsters. It comes from ordinary people doing terrible things for good reasons. And that darkness is still with us today, lurking in classified documents and black budgets, waiting for the next crisis to justify its return. The Phoenix has risen from its ashes. It wears different names now, operates in different countries, targets different enemies, but it's the same bird of prey, circling overhead, waiting for the order to strike. In the end, Operation Phoenix accomplished exactly what it set out to do. It eliminated the Viet Cong infrastructure and demonstrated the effectiveness of systematic assassination as a tool of state crime. The fact that it also destroyed South Vietnamese society, killed thousands of innocent people, and corrupted the moral foundations of American foreign policy was simply the cost of doing business. That's the real horror of Phoenix. Not that it failed, but that it succeeded. And because it succeeded, it will be tried again. The only question is,